My name is Kevin Nilson, and we're all here to learn about ways of testing in all browsers. And that's, I think, with HTML5 and you know, the great uptake we've seen over the last few years. This is hopefully this is a very timely session for everyone. So I've actually given this talk. It's actually been a while since I've given this talk, and at the time it was you know, HTML5 was really just coming into play, and that's where I really got interested in this. But I think today it's a valuable thing for everybody. So while everybody was walking in, I had this puzzler up on the board for folks to, you know, we're all familiar with the Java puzzlers, and you know, we'll come back to this in a minute. But look at this, and you'll get kind of some of the understanding of how JavaScript is difficult, and you know, it's a very, very simple one. So this presentation, just so you guys know, is part of the HTML5 Rocks presentation. It's all done in HTML5, and it's a nice, if you haven't gone to the HTML5 Rocks website, it's really great. And I'm using their kind of slideware instead of like PowerPoint or Keynote, and it's really nice. But you know, none of you probably want to use this. It wasn't that interesting. But they have all the demos of how to use all the features of HTML5, one slide at a time, running live right in the slide. So with the code examples, and so I definitely recommend people check out the HTML5 Rocks slides. So welcome everybody. A little bit about me. I'm Kevin Nilson, VP of Engineering at Just Me, and that's a startup in Google Startup Labs. We use all Java technology where we can. So it's we're a Spring MVC shop, and then we're mostly in the mobile space, so doing native iPhone and Android applications. A little bit about me: I'm a Java champion. Last year, JavaOne Rockstar. So hopefully everybody will submit their feedback again today, and who knows, maybe we'll get lucky enough that will happen again. I authored a book several years ago, Web 2.0 Fundamentals, and actually still a lot of relevant stuff in there. And I'm probably most known in the Valley and around the world for running 3 of the largest user groups in Silicon Valley. So I run the Java user group, the JavaScript meetup, and the Google Technology user group, or Google Developer group is what they call those now. So I run about 30 free events a year, and all of them are kind of about this size. So a lot of fun. And I guess the last note on there is I'm not really a testing person, you know. I'm an architect. I come from a Java background, and then kind of moving, you know, as things are hot, moving from, you know, doing Java server-side to doing Java web to doing HTML5 jQuery stuff, and then now I'm actually doing a lot of Android stuff. So that's kind of the progression. So here's what we're going to talk about today. A little bit of where we're at in the web, testing overview, some old school ways of doing things, some of the more modern, and some of the next generation stuff, which is done with QUnit and TestSwarm is what I think is kind of the best options out there. And all of that is kind of sewn together with Jenkins. And I assume most of you have experience with Jenkins or know what it is or know what Hudson is. It's a really great tool, and we'll be showing that a little bit later. So I kick things off kind of introducing this as to puzzlers, right? So one of the best-selling books is the Java Puzzler, and you always are just amazed with, you know, what actually happens with a particular line of code, and some of the smartest people you know can never figure it out. Well, JavaScript, there's like puzzlers everywhere, right? And that's not even like how it behaves in different browsers, but that's even within one browser. I mean, looking at a piece of code, you have no idea what's going to happen, and then that code is going to run differently in every single browser. So HTML4 specifically is very ambiguous as to what can happen and how things behave. So JavaScript has a lot of puzzlers. So one of the things I had up when you guys walked in was this puzzler. It's kind of simple. It looks like it says A, XYZ, B, XYZ, C, XYZ, right? And how many of you think that's the answer, right? Obviously none of you, but do we have any ideas does anyone know what the answer is? Anyone? Yeah. Very good. Anyone else agree with him or disagree? Yeah. AXYZ. And why is it AXYZ? Because I is global scope, okay? So if you see here how I does not have a var, right? We didn't declare it as a variable. So JavaScript by default is global scope. So all these variables that you use within your methods here, or within your functions, sorry, we're in JavaScript, within your functions take global scope. So, so here I can show you kind of, just so that you guys believe me. So here's a QUnit test showing that, you know, the diff of what you expected was that, and what you actually got is something a little bit different, a little bit less. So, you know, I mean, this is just a classic example where, you know, you see how you'd expect things to behave, but they don't exactly behave the same. And this is QUnit, very similar to JUnit. It's a really great tool. I really like it. It was QUnit, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but it was written as part of jQuery, you know, written by John Resig to as a framework to test jQuery. So next thing I want to jump into a little bit, just to give you some of this background, is prefixes and what they are, right? So a lot of times you see the Moz or the different WebKit prefixes in front of your CSS, which you can see kind of down here for transitions and things like that. And you know, one of the main objectives of HTML5, you know, I met with Ian Hixie, the creator of HTML5, and I said, Ian, you know, what's the main goal here? What are you really trying to solve? And it wasn't new features. You know, all that was just icing on the cake. But for him, it was about defining a non-ambiguous spec, really fully defining how everything should behave. And you look at this and you see, you know, what's really going on here. So what's going on here is traditionally what browser vendors would do is they would launch their implementation, and then people would see that it doesn't behave how it's supposed to. And then what would happen is things like jQuery, Dojo, Prototype Scriptaculous would come along and try to like put an API in front of these to standardize these, and then you're stuck with this kind of broken implementation forever. So one of the things they did in HTML5 was to make the spec not be ambiguous, to try to fully define every single thing out there, how it should behave in different scenarios. But then it leaves that next question of, are the IE guys going to implement that correctly? Because they didn't get a hell of a lot else correct, right? So that's why we have prefixes. They go out there. You can use this stuff today. It's about, you know, it is about the spec is still moving, but it's also about getting it out in the wild with people before they lock it in without the prefix in the browser. So back to our fun. Here is another puzzler that's significantly simpler. So what is the length of my variable, or I guess I should have said my array, huh? Not too much sleep. I got a 2-week-old baby. So, what is it? Somebody said 4. Somebody said 4. 3? 3's 4? Uh-oh. Absolutely right. So both of you are wrong, or maybe both of you are right. However, glass half empty, glass half full. My glass is completely empty. But yeah, and which browser do you know? In IE, the length is yes. So in IE 8, in IE 6, 7, 8, right? The length of this is 4. In all other WebKit browsers, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, you name it, the length of this is 3, right? And you think about this, you know, people are testing their code, and they're a lot of times dynamically generating this kind of JSON or JavaScript objects, and you kind of add an element and a comma, add an element and a comma, add an element and a comma. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this, right? And do you know what the value is of the 4th element? I believe it's undefined. Yeah, it's undefined. And I can actually show you that oops, let me unzoom out. So in Chrome, you can do the Option Command I, or I don't know, you get it from the Tools menu or something. But down here, you can go into the console, and I kind of doubt my ability to type that, so I'm going to paste that in. Let's zoom in down here so you guys can see. And we'll put so here I'm able to live kind of code JavaScript, which is kind of fun. And my variable dot length, and it is 3, but it's not always 3. So I was going to bring like a netbook with me in IE8 to show you that it isn't 3, but I felt too embarrassed to walk around the conference here with IE8. So if anyone has an IE8 that they want to confirm, don't speak up, because that's anyway. So evolution of the web, where we are, right? Back in 91, HTML, HTML2 kind of moving through. We started using CSS and JavaScript in 96. About the time I graduated high school, although I look much older, I feel much older, but in 97, HTML4, CSS2, 2002 is probably where things started getting interesting, with CSS, doing tableless web design, and kind of then 2005, we're doing things we never thought were possible with Ajax, right? And that really kind of changed the whole world of the web, of not having to refresh the entire page. I know the Oracle guys used to call it partial page refresh. And then in 2009, Ian was out there, got excited, and HTML5 was born with a lot of really great stuff. So let's shift gears out of kind of the web and talk about testing, because that's what a lot of this talk is sort of about. And it's, why should developers be using automated testing, right? And, this stuff is really bleeding edge, right? The implementations in the browser are changing. The specs are moving. Developers are really just figuring out how to do this, right? So I polled the room of how many of you are doing HTML5 or web stuff, and it was, sort of a 5–10% are doing it a significant amount of time throughout their day. So really that's, it's so bleeding edge, and both on the technology side, but also on developers and what they're learning. Next big thing is, every time you check in a line of code, you're kind of taking this risk, And I had a boss one time who wanted to push daily updates into production, and I kind of said, that's great to get those features out there, but why don't we bundle them up and do a release once a week? Things like that, so that we can do more regression, more testing, and things like that. But I think the real answer to that is more, we should be doing something like continuous deployment, where tests are automated, right? They're there. Developers don't have to think about them, and make that possible. And we'll talk a little bit about that coming up soon. Another thing that is really important about testing is kind of early bug detection. Really saves you time, really saves you money, and really saves you embarrassments, right? So if I'm writing code and then I push a button and it runs 1,000 regressions within 2 seconds, I know if I've broke something else. Code tends to be brittle, a lot of dependencies, a lot of things that you really can't test. And if I write a line of code and 10 seconds later it tells me it's broke, I can fix that right away. If a day later it tells me it's broke, or we'll say an hour later, the cost is a little bit more. I can probably open up the file, I can like swig down my coffee, I can probably get my head back in it. I've made a context switch. Maybe I'm calling my girlfriend or my wife, whatever, and I got to get back into it. You start talking about a day later, you start talking QA cycles like 2 weeks later, the cost of that, next it becomes finger pointing. It was him, no, it must have been server side, it was in the browser, it worked yesterday, I didn't change anything. We get all kinds of like inner office politics, working about whose bug this is and making sure, because it brings in that embarrassment factor also. So anyway, I think developers should do test-driven development and mostly for a lot of that, right? And it lets you verify your work, speeds up your development, and the most important thing for me at the bottom is it lets you move on to something else, right? If you have something and you're the only one who understands all the rules of how it works, you know, and no one has confidence to write code, if you have a good regression suite that is written by developers for developers and integrated into the development process, you can hire someone and, you know, within 2 hours have them writing code. Where typically, you know, that's like a 3-month proposition, and what that means is that you're not going to be able to like get someone's time who's valuable, because they're not going to be able to spend 3 months learning your stuff, right? So you want to be able to make it as easy as possible for people to get in, and you have a lot more likelihood of having someone like intelligent take over your stuff. So a little more background, I want to talk about the difference between manual testing and and automated testing, right? So none of us want to be monkeys, right? So every time I write a line of code, I really don't want to open up a browser, open up a mobile device, be clicking around kind of hunting for bugs and seeing if this works. And as the app becomes more and more complex, gosh, it takes so much longer to do this. And you end up only testing that one feature. And I'm sure every single one of you has had huge regressions that they had no idea what else was broke because of that. So another kind of interesting thing here is this. Google has this blog often referred to as testing on the toilet, and they put these little they put these little things over the toilets, so you have some interesting reading. And they have a whole series on testing because they think it's so important. But one of the catchphrases that they put on there sometimes is life is too short for manual testing. So it's definitely, I don't want to be a monkey, and I'm sure you don't either. So the other thing we should talk about is kind of unit test versus integration test. So unit test really test that deep internal piece. And I think when you're doing server-side, I'm sure most of you are familiar with unit test. When you're doing server-side stuff, I think this is probably the most important piece, right? But at least my opinion is that when you're doing client-side stuff, a lot of times the integration tests are a lot more valuable than what the unit tests are. So I kind of, server-side, I like to favor unit test. Client-side, I like to favor integration test. And the integration test is really clicking on buttons, looking at the screen, looking at what the values are, and a lot of times you're sort of black box. You don't really know, for say, what's going on under the covers in there. But I think it provides a whole lot more value. So here's some kind of pros and cons. Manual testing is really great for catching visual things. You're never going to see if your CSS lines up and things like that. You can definitely test like the sizes of things. The biggest downside is it's extremely time consuming. So most people will tell me, you know, people who work for me will say, Kevin, I don't have time to test my code. Well, you know, you're going to have to manually test that code 1,000 times in the next 6 months. Or you're going to have to write a little script that may be like 10 lines of code once. So 10 lines of code versus like 1,000 times of clicking around being a monkey. For me, it's an easy decision, but it's definitely hard. You really have to push hard to get people doing that. And one of the things I do is I say, like, you know, when I close a Jira card, I close something, I say, well, it's not closed or it's not finished until there's an automated test written for that feature. So that's one of the things I do as management to try to help things out. And the last disadvantage there is it's often skipped, right? So people don't even test; they just commit and go, and you know, that's what you get. So automated testing is really great because it's a one-time cost. It's a whole lot less expensive. It runs with no effort once you've written that test, and it can be part of your process, right? If you make it part of the process through automation, tools like Jenkins, it just happens. People don't have to think about it. People don't forget because they can't, but it doesn't catch those visual things. So you still have to kind of try it out, feel things out, and things like that. So ways of doing test automation. One of them is at build time, right? Ant, Maven, Gradle, all these things. Unfortunately, that can become, I don't know, extremely annoying. right? Every time you're like trying to run your app, you really don't want all these regressions. You know things are broken. You're not ready to commit. You don't really want it to run at that time. It'd be nice if you could run it at that time, but you don't want it to happen every single time. So you end up wasting a lot of time. Another way is an SVN hook, right? So you can do that with part of SVN. When you kind of check in code, like before you can check in code, it kind of runs these, it'll run this regression before it actually lets it in. And it's just very nice because it lets you catch bugs before you share them with others. But there's no way to wait for other check-ins. So sometimes you need to check in a server-side piece and a client-side piece, but then my tests are running. And it may run too often because of that. My preferred method is continuous integration, tools like Jenkins, Hudson, Cruise Control, Ant Pro. You probably just want to use Jenkins though, but there's other options out there if you'd like Bamboo as well. But Jenkins is probably the best option there, and you get all the advantages. Sharing things before, checking things before they're shared with others. Can wait for a quiet period. So after a check-in, I can say, don't run this for another 5 minutes, and you can limit frequency and things like that. So you can run small smoke tests with each check-in once a day, once a week, run more extensive tests. So here's kind of overview unit testing versus integration testing. Unit testing is really testing the building blocks, the deep internals, maybe private or protected methods in Java, where integration test is often with dependencies. It depends on a database. It depends on a service if you're doing HTML5. And it really tests, does this whole thing work together as a whole? Often kind of referred, I kind of blur the line between integration and functional testing, but similar kind of things. So old school testing, I'm going to talk about next, and this is kind of how you feel, like you're, anyway, crash test dummy here. So here's some old tools that used in the past. JSUnit, it's kind of not that good. It's a port of JUnit to JavaScript. It doesn't really make sense, really, if you're a hardcore JavaScript jQuery developer. In Java, there's the Rhino implementation, which is leveraged quite a bit, and I actually used it for Web 1.0 stuff with a tool called Canoo Webtest. And Canoo Webtest was a wrapper on top of HTTP unit that was really nice. Lets you do a little bit of Groovy, things like that. It's great. So if you're just getting started, you don't really care if it runs in all browsers, this is a nice solution where it runs in Java. You never have to launch a browser, because that's a lot of the difficulty, is having browsers kind of running throughout automation. So this is a Canoo Webtest I highly recommend if you are doing Web 1.0 kind of things and you're not really, you're writing some administrative pages and you just want to make sure they work. Here's kind of an example. Go to the URL, google.com, verify that there is the text Google. For the Q, for like the query, say web test, and click the I'm feeling lucky button. I always feel lucky. And verify that you got the results for Canoo Web Test. So that's an example of that. There's some not modern testing. You guys can read this on the slide sometime, but kind of, whoops, automating clicking things around. So Selenium. I'm sure everybody here has heard of Selenium, right? So Selenium's a really, really great tool, but I don't recommend it. So some of the great features about it are that it has a great recorder. So if you really have no idea what you're doing and you're a monkey, this is one step better. It kind of lets you like click and drag around in your app and record. And it kind of records into an HTML format that you can kind of export. So it records into an HTML table, right? Which I'll show in the next slide, or maybe I'll show that here. And then you can kind of convert this into Java. So once you've converted into Java, you have no more click and record. There's no more maintenance. And this is like your test format, which is like open google.com, type in Q, hello world, wait for the text Wikipedia, whatever it is, right? So that's kind of what it looks like. Not so interesting. And problems with Selenium, there is absolutely no support for JavaScript. So you have all your JavaScript HTML5 people, and you tell them to write Java or write, it doesn't make sense, right? Python, things like that. They don't want to do that, They're really in the JavaScript world. They want to be able to do things like unit testing, right? And this is completely a black box tool. One of the other biggest problems is, browsers, right? You can only run your test in one browser. There are some Selenium RC, some different things, but it really isn't designed. I can't take my Android phone and have my Selenium test run on my Android phone. I can't run it on a tablet, any of these other things that we really want to do today. So now I want to talk about QUnit, which is kind of the base of how you can test in all browsers, mobile, desktop, all the different browsers you'd like. And we were showing an example earlier of some QUnit. And here's a sample results, sort of different tests. They were failing. Very, very similar to JUnit reports if you've looked at those. Really nice. It tells you the user agent. You can click into it. You can rerun it. You can rerun only. I didn't put there's little check boxes you can put up here with a different style sheet. But it's a really great tool. You can say only rerun those that have failed, right? So here's kind of an example of QUnit so you can kind of get a feel for it. And later I'll show this running in Jenkins with TestSwarm. And so I run these 3 examples, so I'll kind of walk through them. The first one is maybe another puzzler is 1 equal to the string 1, right? So everybody knows, or maybe not everybody knows, but those are equal in JavaScript. So is 2 equal to the string 2? Yes, it is. Okay? So that's my first one. We want to kind of verify that in all browsers, right? Because we looked earlier at what would happen, which I kind of show here, right? So you can't really see the red. I think the red's a little bit out, but the comma here and undefined at the end, and we talk about how IA8 and earlier, the length here is 4, but in other browsers it's 3. So the last example here is like a forced failure, right? So this is a forced failure. I just said okay. You can also put true here for false in the forced failure, just so you can see kind of how it reports failures along the way, right? So let's look at these. So here's the first example with the, it passes. Here's the second example. It passes because I'm in Chrome, a real browser. So I see that the length is 3, not 4. And then the last one, we have this forced failure. I should have done a different thing where you could see the difference like you did in the other one using equals rather than okay, but you kind of get the feel for what's going on there, right? So QUnit's really nice, right? This is jQuery. These are closures, something that's finally coming to Java. Yeah, I can tell you a lot about closures. So my first meeting as a jug leader, or my second meeting as a jug leader, was Neil Gafter giving the closure proposal like 6 years ago. So anyway, we've been very happy on the JavaScript side for a long time. So how do you run these QUnit, right? You have the JavaScript. So all you need to do is add the QUnit JS. There's an inject if you want to do TestSwarm. That's kind of the optional piece for running it in all browsers. And then run your script. And there's a style sheet up here, a QUnit CSS that is required. And that's what gives you the styling. So we'll talk about this. So you can see all you have to do is add a style sheet and then add a div, which I didn't talk about here, of where to put the results. And it just goes in and injects things into that div based on its ID. So what are the limitations or difficulties? Is it requires a custom HTML5 or an HTML web page for running these tests. So if you're doing unit testing, you really have no way to run that anyway. So it's kind of nice. It's kind of a pro where I define a page that lets me test my internal functions. But if you have like a website, it's kind of difficult. So one of the things that I do, and this is just an example of like a version of my website that never went live, but you can put kind of, we put like a question mark at a query string, test equals, and then a path to a test. It's like a SQL injection friend, or sorry, did I say cross-site scripting friend? But anyway, and what it does, I have a div at the bottom here, and server side kind of in a JSP or something like that. free marker template, whatever it is, I inject the QUnit to run against your page, right in your page. And nobody ever sees that unless they add the query string to run that particular test. Another thing I want to talk about is FuncUnit, right? So imagine you give me your application, be it web, be it Swing, whatever it is, and I kind of take like a robot and I click buttons as fast as possible, right? I type in, maybe we do some sort of type in a state, you type in, you're doing a drop down, you type I and it gives you Illinois, you type C, it gives you California, and as you're doing this, you're immediately verifying these things, or you're trying to run a test right away as fast as you can possibly click. Well, that's not really feasible, right? You click, you have to wait for the screen to paint, you have to wait for things to render. So there's something called FuncUnit, which is part of JavaScript MVC, and there's a nice piece here called visible, and it's sort of like saying, I want to click, or I want to type JavaScript. This is an autocomplete test, and I want to take the input and click on it, and then type JavaScript. I want to wait for sort of this autocomplete item. I want to wait for this autocomplete item right here. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mouse. To be visible before I check its size. Right? I have to wait for the thing to drop down and become visible. Append2 has another thing. It's called when available and when true. I kind of extended it to add when true. That does a similar thing, but FuncUnit's a lot more. I don't have that much experience with it, but it's a lot more popular. So you should look at that. So now let's talk about how do we make this happen in all browsers, and what's the real next generation, right? So here I just have kind of the browsers, but then now we have, Android phones, we have iPhones, we have tablets and all these devices, and you really want it just to sort of seamlessly run everywhere, right? So let me introduce TestSwarm. So at the bottom you can see it's a little PHP app that runs, is the TestSwarm server, and all your browsers connect to it. So all you have to do is go to a URL. You go to a URL and say, I would like to help you test. So if you have 9 different browsers, you have lots of phones. If you have as many Android phones as me, you're very lucky. You connect them all, and different versions. You can see here, Firefox 345, IE 678, Opera, all these things. And when they are all connected, anyone who sends a test to the TestSwarm server, you start thinking about Jenkins and how it can fit into this. You can have an SVN hook, you can have Jenkins, Git hooks, any kind of job. You could do it with a cron job. You make this submission to TestSwarm, and then it fires it off to all those browsers. They run the test for you, and then get the results and show them back, right, in a centralized server. And so this is kind of what it looks like. This is an older picture. They no longer segment by operating system, but they used to. They found this was a little less useful now that kind of the direction things are moving with Chrome adoption and things like that. But basically, you can see all these browsers. So if you want to do like monkey testing, I say like every time you write a line of code, can you please test in all these browsers? You really can't do that. It's not manageable at all to do that. So Selenium versus TestSwarm, pros and cons. TestSwarm configuration, there's absolutely none. You just go to a URL. That's all you need to do. Selenium, it tries to kind of launch a browser for you. It's kind of difficult there. Browser support, everything, even mobile. Selenium's kind of limited in just being able to support a few browsers. They're both open source. And I do recommend Selenium. I mean, if you want something very simple, you're not making a huge investment, it's a good way to go. But it doesn't really get you where you want to be, at least not where I want to be. JavaScript support, Selenium, sort of, but TestSwarm's really great. And adoption, unfortunately, TestSwarm's not that well adopted. So maybe you guys will see it and like it and start using it. So, but I think these click and drag tools always become more adopted anyway. So what is Jenkins, right? So Jenkins is a great tool. It lets you schedule builds, kind of a cron job style. You can say every hour, every day, every minute, whatever you like. You can pull SCM, or there's GitHub pushes, commit hooks, and things like that. But basically what it does is it runs jobs for you. So you can run a shell script and do things. You can compile Java code, which is most common. You can do all kinds of things. But what's really great is it has a great plugin framework inside of it, and it's very easy to write plugins. So I looked at TestSwarm, and I said, well, I want things to be scheduled periodically. I want easy reporting. I want emails on failures, and I want it to run in all browsers. So I said, how do I get my Jenkins to integrate with TestSwarm? And so I wrote a plugin, right? So here's the link to the plugin. You guys can all try it out. It's really great. It's one of the official Jenkins plugins, and it really helps things out. And I definitely have a big thanks for KK back there for helping me kind of push that through to make it possible. I talked to him last night, and so I got to the very last step of making this available to everyone, and I had 6 more days until my baby was supposed to be born. And you guys can fill in the blanks what happened. So I got everything done except for the very last step. I had some typo somewhere that said authentication failure. And the KK, the creator of Hudson and Jenkins back there, so big round of applause for him for making that possible. So do a quick demo here of showing you kind of Jenkins, TestSwarm, and use them together with a plugin that I wrote. And so hopefully this is kind of fun. It was the first time I used iMovie since like, I don't know, 4 years ago, JavaOne thing. So the first thing you do is take all your browsers and join the swarm. So all they do is go to one URL, right? And you can see them all lined up here: Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Android, and iPhone. And they're all kind of waiting to run test. And how they do it is they actually put an iframe inside of the browser. So the outer browser is TestSwarm, and then there's an iframe. You can actually see it down here. This is where it looks different in this browser than it does in these. Right? So that's kind of what it does. And here you've got a Jenkins job, and I go into it. I'm going to configure and kind of show you. So there's past results of different browsers. So I have 3 tests, 1, 2, 3, the 3 that we talked about. I can disable within my plugin. Some fail, some pass. Just kind of fooling around here for a demo, and you know, that's kind of what we have there. So here I'll show you how to configure that plugin. And the Wi-Fi here never works, and you guys know that, and so that's why I made a video. so here's the plugin that I actually have. So sorry, there we are. Oh, back here. So we can kind of start here. So you can see kind of configuring that. You define the 3 tests, the first test, and there's the URL to run my test, and that's the same URL that I have right here, right? So I can run it in my one browser, and then you see that passes. I can run this in this browser. It's the exact same URL. So I take that same URL and I say, I want this run in all browsers, not just this one. And I can add a cache cracker, because you know sometimes browsers, the way that they work, it adds a query string at the end, because that was a nice feature that I found I've used this a lot, and that helped me. Another thing is you do all these configurations of test 1, test 2, test 3, and then you have a known failure. So you want to be able to like just comment that out, kind of do an ignore, add ignore in JUnit. So if you just check the little box here, it will disable this test for a little bit. So it's actually very, very useful. So here we're going in, and you configure the tap results, and there you can see the one test running. So it's building, and if you watch down here, you'll see it run in this browser. So there it's polling, and because TestSwarm has an API, there it went. So there it ran, right? So TestSwarm has an API, a JSON API, that you can, so what I did was I just pulled that every 30 seconds. I know it's configurable, you can tell how often to pull, but I pulled that and checked for these results. So here you can see, if you watch this is actually in the TestSwarm. I printed out a link, or sorry, in Jenkins I printed out a link to TestSwarm so that you could see, you can actually go into TestSwarm, right? So I'm just doing a quick wrapper, and if you watch right in here when I play, you can see that like it's loading, it's waiting, it's ran, test 3 failed in Chrome. Test 2 passed, and test 1 is about to run. And so here it goes, and it turns green. You can't really see on the screen so well, but you can see it on my screen very well. So there you see, oops, kind of that interesting piece. Here, we'll go back just a minute. And you can see what happens. Oops. Oh, I'm so quick. There we go. Here is test 2, which is the length of the array. And you can see in IE9, 4 tests passed. 1 test was read in IE8, and that's where IE8 thinks it's the length of 3. IE9 thinks it's the length of, shit, I just did it backwards. IE8 thinks it's 4, and IE9 thinks it's 3. But it's correct in the other, passing here in green, 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 all the way across. Then you can look at individual test results. Where did it fail? You can see here it failed in IE8, and you can actually look at what was the result. The length was 3. It's a really great, TestSwarm's a great tool. It just doesn't provide the scheduling ability, the hooks into continuous integration, and it doesn't provide any email ability. So here I actually print out the tap report results, right? So I go ahead and show them to you right inside of Jenkins, because this is what's going to go out in your email. So you can see 1 to 3 tests ran. You can see that example 1, sorry, it's a little grainy. It was okay. Test result 2 was failing in IE, but passed in all these other browsers. Android, Chrome, Safari, 5, and 6. And then the third one failed in all browsers and passed in no. I should clean that up and make it an empty string, but it doesn't really matter. And the end result is a failure, which will give you red balls, and we all want blue balls with Jenkins. So it will give you red balls and then send you those email failures. So here I'm highlighting it's IE8, and here this one failed in all browsers. And then you look at the charts there, it shows. Here you can drill into, if you click on that chart, you can look at the individual results, what they were, and this is the TAP protocol. It's a standard protocol used by Python and all kinds of people. Gives you a little bit more power. This is what it kind of looks like. Gives you a little bit more power than what JUnit does, as far as what you can do there. So some of the other things, oh, what's that? No. So some of the other things that I've used in the past are, I built, using the Jenkins APIs, which here I kind of talk about. You just go API JSON, or you can do API XML, and you can actually get the results of your jobs, which are passing, which are failing. It kind of tells you a lot about that. And then I use that, and I use sunspots. They have like little LED lights. And so I could monitor all my builds at once and see which ones are passing and which ones are failing. And it's kind of like a mesh network. So I put them, all the people that report to me have one on their desk, and they can see at any given time like which tests are up and which tests are down, and kind of watch things. I'm actually not doing that right now, but at my last job, I did a lot of that. And it was actually very useful to know at any given time. I kind of walk in, I can see what's green or what's red. Another great thing that I've done is, I wrote a plugin for VirtualBox, right? So if you're familiar with VirtualBox, it's like a virtual environment where I would use a single Ubuntu server and then have 2 versions of Windows, right? Because I need to test, at the time I was testing in 10 browsers, so I needed IE6, 7, 8, 9, I needed, Chrome, I needed Safari, all the different versions, 4, 5, 6, and what I actually did is I took the startup script in Windows and had it in the startup script launch a browser, going to the URL to connect to TestSwarm, right? And really what this allows you to do is with Jenkins integration with VirtualBox, you can just once a week say reboot these browsers, or once a night say reboot these browsers, because you can't run tests against them all the time. There's actually a VirtualBox plugin that you could use. That's why I didn't really try to publish my own, but honestly I could never make the darn thing work, so I just wrote my own. So maybe others have had success, but I didn't. So I just rolled my own, but I didn't feel like competing. It probably would have been faster if I just contacted the developers. So we got just a little bit of time. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Headless, no. So what I did, at my previous job is I walked around the office and I took all the old machines. I found people that had 10 machines in their desk. I said, can I have one of those? And that was where I really started. So I had in my desk, then I had 10 machines. So I could get all the IEs. Because you can use IE Tester, but you can really only have one version of IE. And you really want to go back, at least to 7, maybe 6, 7, 8. Unfortunately, that's what you have to do, right? And so I'd stack these browsers up and have them in the startup script to launch, and then I could just reboot them. And then eventually I got a little bit smarter, and that's where I started working with VirtualBox. I could have a single Ubuntu server running VirtualBox and have 4 different verts running at once, and then I could reboot the vert from Jenkins. Then when it would reboot, it would launch all the browsers, and I had a suite of 10 browsers because those were the supported browsers by the financial company I worked at. So I actually had no one who actually physically had to connect. But then when I wanted to just, before a release or something like that, I would launch it in all browsers. Just have people physically connect to a URL. You definitely don't have to have a person present to connect, a device. So, yeah.
Does it also does it do active test on CSS?
So TestSwarm runs a lot of things. You can actually use TestSwarm to write Selenium tests. I use it to write QUnit tests. That's really what it was originally kind of designed for. So you can write any kind of test that you want in QUnit, in jQuery, and it will run them in all browsers. So that's a lot of the idea, Newton. So good. Yeah. Any other questions, anyone? So I want to thank everybody for coming out. You're welcome to connect to my TestSwarm server and play around and look at that. Do I have Safari up? So here's when I go to the page. It says, hey, would you like to join the swarm? Because we need your help. And I have one Chrome, and you type your name in here. Whoops, I misspelled my name. And now it starts running test right away. So that's kind of the general idea. So I had test waiting for this browser because I was submitting tests in an automated fashion. So it's kind of fun, and this is it. So thanks a lot, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you. Yeah.